Zoe Martin was the quintessential suburban mother and wife. Her days were perfectly orchestrated to fit the lives of her husband, Frank, and their teenage daughter, Maddie. From the outside, her life was a well-oiled machine, fueled by routine and responsibility. Frank worked a high-stress job as a financial consultant, often leaving early and coming back exhausted, while Zoe ran the household with ease, balancing Maddie's school schedule, PTA meetings, and dinner parties with practiced grace. But Zoe had secrets. Deep, quiet longings she kept hidden under layers of practicality and responsibility. These feelings she had carefully buried over the years, masked by smiles and effortless organization. And then, one day, an email arrived in her inbox with a subject line that brought her past crashing back into her present. "Hey Zoe, it's been a while." She knew that he instantly, even though it had been years since they'd last spoken. Eric, the guy she had once considered her soulmate, the wild, artistic spirit she had fallen in love with in college. They had shared dreams of escaping the mundane, traveling the world, creating art, and living freely. But life had taken them in different directions. She had chosen Frank, the stable, dependable partner, and a life that felt secure. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed a simple reply. "It has. How are you?" Their exchange of messages became a daily ritual. What started as small updates soon deepened into heartfelt confessions. Eric was still the same, she discovered, a passionate artist who never quite settled down. He sent her pictures of his latest art installations, and in return, she shared glimpses of her life, carefully editing out the discontent she couldn't articulate. But her secret wasn't to last. Maddie, her observant, wit-smart daughter, sensed the change. She noticed her mother's phone screen lighting up with notifications and Zoe's careful attention to it, the way she smiled softly at messages no one else was supposed to read. One afternoon, Maddie stood in the kitchen, waiting to talk to her mother about an upcoming school event. Zoe had her back turned, laughing softly at something on her phone. Maddie felt a pang of unease. Her mother had always been there, steady and unwavering, and this new secret side to Zoe felt like something fragile that could break their world. Maddie tried to dismiss her suspicions, but a nagging curiosity gnawed at her. She adored her mom and couldn't imagine her doing anything that would hurt their family. But in a quiet moment of weakness, she found herself going through Zoe's texts when her mother left her phone unattended in the kitchen. What she saw was shattering. Zoe's words painted a picture of a woman Maddie didn't recognize. She read snippets of her mother's longing for a freedom she had once tasted, a life she had sacrificed for the family. And then, Eric's name, an old college boyfriend. Maddie's heart twisted as she read Zoe's reply to him. Maybe in another life, we could have had it all. It felt like she had discovered something forbidden, a hidden part of her mother that wasn't meant for her. She wondered what it meant. Did her father know? Had her mother ever considered leaving them? Maddie's mind raced with questions, none of which she wanted to confront Zoe with just yet. Instead, she chose to stay silent, grappling with her emotions and the overwhelming weight of her discovery. The days following her revelation were tense. Maddie watched her mother closely, picking up on the subtle cues she had previously overlooked. Zoe's laughter had a different edge, her smiles were tinged with wistfulness, and her eyes held a spark that Maddie hadn't noticed before. She saw how her mother's happiness seemed to come from something outside their home, and it scared her. It also made her think about the dreams her mother might have had, dreams that were so different from the life she'd built with Frank. Meanwhile, Frank sensed the shift in his daughter's demeanor. Maddie had always been bright and spirited, but lately, she was quieter, more introspective. He chalked it up to the typical teenage mood swings, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And then, there was Zoe, her newfound vibrancy, the way she seemed to drift off during conversations, lost in thoughts he wasn't part of. In an attempt to bridge the growing distance, Frank suggested a family dinner out. Maddie could see his hope that it might pull them all back together, but Zoe was distracted throughout the evening. Maddie's unease only deepened as she watched her mother smile absently at her father's attempts at humor. She wanted to tell her father what she knew, but she couldn't bear the thought of shattering his world. Instead, Maddie tried to understand her mother's actions, her choices. She read Zoe's texts again late one night, scrolling through messages filled with a passion that felt foreign, yet oddly compelling. As much as she despised Eric for pulling her mother into this secretive world, she found herself intrigued by him too. He represented everything her mother had sacrificed, a life of creativity and abandon, of spontaneity and risk. It was a life Maddie herself had only dreamed of. In a moment of impulsive bravery, Maddie sent Eric a message from her mother's phone. "I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I need to see you." A response came quickly. "Let's meet up. Saturday, for example, at the cafe. We can pick another day if you want. Maybe you want to go somewhere else?" Maddie's pulse quickened. It was her mother's choice to make, but she felt a strange connection to the path Zoe had once considered. She felt the weight of her mother's dreams, her lost sense of self, and the quiet heartbreak that had led her to this moment. As luck would have it, Zoe didn't see that someone had written a message on her behalf. Zoe's eyes just caught on the latest messages from Eric, who was happily and actively suggesting different options and places to meet. When Saturday arrived, Zoe left the house on the pretext of meeting with coworkers. Maddie, who had overheard her mother's excuse, knew better. She watched Zoe leave, feeling torn between anger and a peculiar sense of solidarity. It was almost as though she understood Zoe's need for something beyond the role of wife and mother, even if it meant betraying Frank. Zoe arrived at the cafe feeling as if she were stepping into a different life. She had chosen a quiet, secluded table by the window, giving her a view of the street and time to gather herself before Eric arrived. She was nervous, her heart raced, her palms were clammy. This was no ordinary meeting, and she couldn't fool herself into believing it was. But seeing Eric again felt like the closing of a circle, a return to something she had lost. Across the street, Maddie watched her mother's movements carefully, staying out of sight. She couldn't believe she was following her mother like this, but she also couldn't bear not knowing the truth. 100 conflicting emotions simmered inside her: fear, betrayal, curiosity, even admiration for the courage it took to do something so forbidden. And so she stayed, watching from a distance, her heart beating as fast as her mother's. Zoe glanced at her watch, but just then, the bell over the cafe door chimed, and there he was. Eric's presence was magnetic, casual, but somehow commanding. He moved towards her with an easy smile, and all at once, she felt a rush of nostalgia, a vivid memory of the days when he was the man she had trusted with all her dreams. He slid into the seat across from her, his eyes bright with warmth and mischief. "Zoe," he said softly, leaning in as if they were sharing a secret. "Eric," she replied, struggling to keep her voice steady, the sound of his name reminding her of who she used to be. They spoke about small things first, their lives, memories from the past. But as the conversation deepened, Zoe found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. It was as if he could read her mind, as though every word they shared peeled back another layer of her defenses. For once, she felt seen completely, unapologetically. "You know," Eric said, his voice low, "I used to think about you all the time. I wondered what it would have been like if we'd ended up together." Zoe's breath caught. It was a dangerous admission, one that exposed a vulnerability she thought she'd hidden away forever. But she couldn't deny the thrill of it, the idea that she was still the woman he had once loved, that she hadn't entirely lost herself in the roles of wife and mother. "Eric, we had our chance. And we both moved on," she replied, her voice a mixture of regret and yearning. "Did we? Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like you ever really moved on, Zoe." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You don't belong in that life, tied down, always second to everyone else's needs." Outside, Maddie leaned against the wall, her emotions a whirlwind. She saw the way her mother looked at this man, the softness in her eyes, the quiet vulnerability. Maddie knew she was watching her mother become someone she had never seen before, someone who frightened her and yet was intriguing in a strange way. Inside, Zoe felt the weight of her life pressing down on her, battling the pull of Eric's words, his charm. She knew she was dancing on the edge of a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But the pull of her own desires, the ones she'd buried so deeply for so long, was undeniable. "Come with me, Zoe," Eric whispered, his voice as gentle as it was persuasive. "Just for tonight. Let's forget everything else, just for one night." She hesitated, torn between the woman she had become and the woman she had tried to forget. But the thought of returning home, to a life where she felt confined, finally tipped the scale. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just tonight." Zoe couldn't bring herself to look around as they left the cafe, feeling both exhilarated and guilty. And Maddie, hiding in the shadows, clenched her fists, her heart pounding as she followed them. She didn't know what she would see, but she knew she had to know it all. Zoe walked beside Eric in a silence that was thick with tension. The air was warm, and as they strolled through the neighborhood, every step toward his place felt like a step closer to a line she couldn't uncross. It wasn't quite night yet. The sky was painted with a soft, hazy pink as the sun dipped lower, casting a gentle glow over the quiet streets. Zoe glanced around, almost expecting to see someone she knew, someone who might call out her name and shatter the fragile illusion she was living in. A few paces behind, Maddie followed, her pulse quickening with each step her mother took. She couldn't believe what she was doing. This wasn't some teenage rebellion or even idle curiosity. It was something darker, something that felt wrong, and yet she couldn't stop herself. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand why her mother would risk everything for this man. Eric's rented house was tucked into a small, shaded lot at the end of the street. It was unassuming and had a slightly weathered charm, the kind of place where a painter might choose to live. The small porch was cluttered with canvases, a few haphazardly stacked paint cans, and a large easel that looked well used. Zoe paused at the gate, and Eric turned to her with a smile that made her heart flutter. "This is it," he said, nodding toward the front door. "Not much, but it's home." Just as she was about to follow him inside, her phone buzzed. She fumbled for it, glancing down at the screen. "Frank." Her heart stopped, and she gave Eric an apologetic look as she turned away slightly to take the call. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Zoe, hey. Just wanted to check in," Frank said, his tone warm but a bit uncertain. "Are you still with your friends? Just wondering when you'd be back home. I thought maybe I'd start dinner." Zoe's throat tightened, and she forced a lightness into her voice. "Oh, yes, I'm still here," she said, glancing quickly at Eric, who was looking at her with a curious expression. "I'll be back soon." Frank chuckled softly, and Zoe felt a pang of guilt twist in her stomach. "All right," he said. "Drive safe, okay?" She ended the call and stood there, staring at her phone, feeling the weight of her decision bearing down on her. For a moment, she considered telling Eric she couldn't stay, that she had to go back to her family, to the life she'd worked so hard to protect. But as she looked up, Eric's gaze was soft and understanding, as if he could see the conflict churning inside her. "Zoe," he said, his voice gentle, "I get it if you want to go home, but maybe just come in for a few minutes? I'd love to show you some paintings." She hesitated, her pulse racing. A small part of her knew she should leave, that every second she stayed was only deepening her own inner turmoil. But the other part, the part that craved freedom, adventure, and the thrill of the unknown, pulled her forward. She nodded, more to herself than to him, and followed him up the steps. Maddie, hidden in the shade of a nearby tree, watched her mother walk into the house, her heart pounding with dread and fascination. She crept closer, finding a spot by the window that allowed her a clear view inside. The space was small but alive with color and life. Canvases lined the walls, some half-finished, others covered with vibrant swirls of paint. Brushes and tubes of paint littered the tables, giving the room an earthy, raw feeling. Zoe wandered through the room, her gaze drawn to the paintings, each one more intense than the last. Eric followed her, his presence close but unobtrusive. "This one," he said, stopping beside a large, abstract piece with swirls of deep blue and fiery red. "It's how I see you, Zoe. Someone who's lived, who's seen so much, but who still has this fire inside. This need to create, to break free." Zoe's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers tracing the air just above the canvas. She felt as though she were seeing herself for the first time, her true self, the one she'd hidden for so long. Eric moved closer, his arm brushing hers, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her. She glanced up at him, her defenses weakening as his hand moved to cup her face. His eyes held hers, and in that instant, everything she had fought against melted away. Outside, Maddie pressed herself against the window, her breath hitching as she watched her mother's face soften, saw her lean into Eric's touch. She knew she should look away, but she was transfixed. This man had a kind of presence she'd never seen in her father. Even Maddie could see the allure in him, and that realization only deepened her turmoil. Inside, Zoe's hesitation crumbled. She allowed herself to be pulled into Eric's embrace, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. Every touch, every breath felt like a release of all the pent-up emotions she had kept buried for years. The guilt was there, but it was drowned out by the surge of passion that flowed between them. His hands moved to her shoulders, then to her waist, and she felt herself drawn even closer, the rest of the world fading into a blur of color and sensation. Outside, Maddie's heart raced as she watched, unable to tear her eyes away. She felt a strange mix of emotions, betrayal, yes, but something else too. She could see why her mother was drawn to him. There was an intensity to him, a wildness that fascinated her. A part of her could almost understand why her mother had chosen this moment, this man. But the other part of her, a part she didn't fully understand, felt betrayed, as though something sacred had been broken. Inside, Zoe's mind was a whirl of emotions. Just as she felt herself slipping fully into the moment, her eyes opened, and a wave of panic washed over her. This wasn't her. She was a mother, a wife, a woman with a family who loved her. She couldn't destroy everything she'd built for one moment of passion. She pulled back suddenly, breaking free from Eric's arms, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding with a mixture of desire and regret. Eric looked at her, startled, but understanding. He stepped back, his eyes searching hers. "Zoe," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I can't," she stammered, her voice choked with emotion. "I shouldn't have come here." Without another word, she gathered her things and hurried toward the door, her mind spinning, her heart torn in two. She felt the weight of her choices bearing down on her, a pressure that was almost too much to bear. Outside, Maddie ducked behind the bushes just in time, watching as her mother stumbled out of the house, visibly shaken. Zoe's face was pale, her expression one of anguish and confusion. She hurried down the path, not noticing her daughter hiding in the shadows. As Zoe walked away, Maddie stayed crouched in the bushes, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction mixed with a gnawing sense of loss. She had seen everything, every unguarded moment of her mother's inner conflict. But now she had questions she couldn't answer, questions that would haunt her every time she looked at her mother. When Zoe finally disappeared down the street, Maddie had witnessed something secret, something forbidden, and she knew that she would never be able to unsee it. Maddie waited in the shadows, her mind spinning as she watched her mother disappear down the street. Her heart raced, not just from what she had witnessed, but also from the undeniable sense that she had crossed a line she couldn't return from. This was no longer her mother's secret alone. It was hers too, a burden she now carried. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and she suddenly felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. She took out her phone, her hand trembling as she unlocked the screen. She'd forgotten about it in the whirlwind of following Zoe and hiding from sight. There were missed calls from her father, and her stomach sank. Dad. In her haste to learn the truth, she had left him worried and clueless about her whereabouts. With only 2% battery remaining, Maddie quickly typed a message. "Dad, don't worry. I'm with Isabella, my classmate. I'll be home soon. If I'm late, her dad will walk me home. She pressed send, feeling the faint vibration as it went through. She had just slipped her phone back into her pocket when she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. Startled, she spun around to find herself face to face with Eric. His gaze was curious but sharp, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but direct. "I saw you watching me. Hiding in the bushes? Is that how young ladies act these days?" Maddie's face flushed. For a moment, fear and embarrassment held her in place. Her mind raced to come up with an answer that might defuse the situation, but nothing seemed right. Then, in a moment of desperate inspiration, she blurted, I'm a fan of your work." Eric's brow arched as he chuckled, shaking his head. "A teenager interested in my paintings? You'll have to try a little harder than that, I think." He glanced at her with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, but something in her face caught his attention. There was something familiar about her, something about her eyes, her expression. "You remind me of someone," he said, studying her face. Maddie swallowed, feeling trapped under his gaze, but also strangely drawn to him. There was something magnetic about his presence, something that felt raw and real, in a way that made her feel both small and significant at the same time. She could see why her mother had felt a pull toward him, why she'd crossed that invisible line to meet him. "Maybe it's because I look like my mom," she admitted, unable to keep the truth at bay any longer. Eric's expression shifted, realization dawning in his eyes. "You're Zoe's daughter," he murmured, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. His voice softened as he looked at her with renewed interest. "Well, that explains it. You have her eyes." Maddie's heart hammered in her chest, but she felt oddly safe, his smile warming her from within. She looked at him, caught between admiration and a strange sensation that she was gazing at someone who was a forbidden part of her world. "She talks about you sometimes," Maddie said softly, knowing it was only a half-truth. "Does she now?" Eric replied, his voice tinged with something that sounded like regret. His gaze softened as he seemed to lose himself in thought, and for a moment, the air between them grew thick with unspoken words. Then, as if waking from a dream, he refocused on her. They stood in silence for a moment, but Maddie could feel her cheeks warming under his gaze. She wasn't sure what to say, and yet she wanted to keep talking to him, to linger in this strange moment a little longer. She noticed how different he was from the men in her life, even her father. He had a quiet intensity that made her heart beat faster, and she felt herself inexplicably drawn to him. Eric tilted his head, watching her closely. "It's getting late," he said gently. "Do you have a way home, or would you like a ride? I can't leave Zoe's daughter out here to find her way alone. I'm sure your family's worried about you." Maddie hesitated, the rational part of her mind warning her that she should say no. But she was captivated, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "That would be great," she said, smiling despite herself. The idea of sitting beside him in his car felt surreal, like a dream she wasn't quite ready to wake up from. They walked to his car, and he opened the door for her, an old-fashioned gesture that made her feel both self-conscious and strangely valued. She slid into the passenger seat, her heart fluttering as he closed the door and circled around to the driver's side. She glanced around the car, taking in the scent of paint and leather, a reminder of the life he led, so different from the one she knew. As they drove, the streetlights flickered past in a blur, casting long shadows across the car's interior. Maddie felt a comfortable silence settle over them, a rare moment of calm amidst the chaos swirling in her mind. They pulled up to her street, and Eric parked next to her house. He turned to her, his expression warm but tinged with an almost paternal concern. "Get home safe, okay?" he said, his voice gentle. "And maybe let's keep this little encounter between us." Maddie nodded, her heart aching with the knowledge that their strange, fleeting connection was bound to remain a secret. She wanted to say something more, to express the mixture of admiration and affection she felt, but the words caught in her throat. She opened the door and stepped out, feeling the cool night air wash over her. As she turned back to thank him one last time, he was watching her with a kind, almost wistful smile. And in that moment, she felt as if she'd been granted a glimpse into a world she didn't fully understand, a world that was somehow a part of her, too. Maddie walked away, the weight of the evening pressing down on her, feeling both older and infinitely more vulnerable. As she approached her front door, she glanced back, but Eric's car had already disappeared, leaving her alone with her secrets and the complicated truth of her mother's hidden life. When Maddie slipped through the front door that evening, she barely had time to catch her breath before she heard her father's voice from the living room. "Maddie? That you?" Frank's voice sounded closer than she expected, and she turned to see him standing in the hallway, his arms folded, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. She forced a casual smile, hoping it would mask the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. "Hey, Dad." "Yeah, just me." Frank looked past her, his brows furrowing slightly. "I thought I saw a car drop you off. Was that Isabella's dad?" Maddie felt her heart skip a beat. She bit her lip, nodding quickly. "Yeah, Isabella's dad," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We were studying at her place, and it got late, so he offered to bring me home." Frank's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than she was comfortable with, but he only nodded and let it go. "All right," he said. "Glad you're home safe." Just then, they heard Zoe's car pulling into the driveway. Maddie felt another surge of nerves as she realized that her mother would be stepping into a scene already filled with tension. She glanced at Frank, who seemed distracted, as if filing her response away for later. When Zoe came in, she did her best to maintain a calm demeanor, but Maddie noticed how her mother's hands shook ever so slightly as she set her keys on the counter. Frank looked at her closely, his expression unreadable, but Zoe avoided his gaze, keeping herself busy with small tasks around the kitchen. They settled into a quiet dinner, everyone absorbed in their own thoughts. Maddie could barely touch her food, her mind replaying her encounter with Eric, her heart fluttering as she remembered his voice, his presence. Zoe, too, was lost in thought, her stomach churning with guilt and regret. She kept replaying the day in her mind, questioning why she had ever thought revisiting the past could bring her anything but heartache. Frank, however, observed it all with a careful eye. He didn't need to pry tonight. He would bide his time, gather what he needed. But a gnawing doubt had taken root in his mind, and he knew he wouldn't be able to shake it until he understood what was really going on. After dinner, they each retreated to their rooms. Maddie lay in bed, her heart filled with thoughts of Eric. She felt a thrill at the idea of seeing him again, of experiencing his attention and charm. She knew it was reckless, foolish even, but she couldn't resist the pull of those emotions. She had never felt this way before, and it was intoxicating. Zoe lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Regret pulsed through her mind like a steady drumbeat. She realized she had allowed her own inner restlessness to lead her astray, and now the memory of her impulsive choices weighed heavily on her. She wondered if the risks she had taken were worth the fleeting rush she had felt with Eric, and she resolved to put the past behind her, to refocus on her family. But part of her knew it wouldn't be that simple. Meanwhile, Frank lay beside her, feigning sleep, his mind churning with suspicion. He had noticed the subtle shifts in Zoe's behavior over the past few weeks, the distracted looks, the extra attention to her appearance, the slightly guarded way she responded to his questions. Something was going on, and he intended to find out what. In the darkness, he began formulating a plan to uncover the truth. The week passed in a tense silence that settled over the house. Zoe, true to her resolve, minimized her communication with Eric. She ignored most of his messages and, when she did reply, kept her responses short and detached. The distance pained her, but she clung to it as a lifeline, a chance to salvage her family and repair the damage she had nearly caused. Maddie, on the other hand, counted the days until the weekend, her mind buzzing with thoughts of Eric. She was too afraid to tell her parents or even her friends about her plan, but she couldn't resist the idea of meeting him again, to spend time with him away from the prying eyes of her family. She knew it was foolish, but she convinced herself it was harmless. These were Maddie's secret plans that Eric knew nothing about. Frank, meanwhile, began his own quiet investigation. On Friday evening, Frank arrived home with takeout from their favorite Italian restaurant, a rare gesture that caught both Zoe and Maddie by surprise. "Dinner's on me tonight," he said with a grin. "Let's have a nice night in." Zoe's face lit up in a mixture of relief and happiness. She set the table eagerly, glad for the warmth and normalcy of a family dinner. Maddie joined in, too, filling the glasses and arranging the silverware, her usual quietness replaced by a sudden energy as they all came together. As they sat down, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in days. Frank served everyone, the smell of pasta and garlic bread filling the room, and they chatted and laughed, the tension momentarily forgotten. But just as they began to relax, Frank's tone shifted and he cleared his throat, glancing between them. "There's something I'd like to talk about tonight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Something that's been weighing on me." Zoe's smile faded and her gaze dropped to her plate. Maddie froze, her eyes darting from her father to her mother, wondering if he somehow knew everything, if he had found out about her mother's hidden meetings. "I've noticed changes," Frank began, his gaze fixed on Zoe. "It's like something's shifted around here, and I can't ignore it anymore. I want to be clear, I don't mean to accuse anyone of anything. I just want to understand what's going on." Zoe's face grew pale, and she forced a shaky smile. "Changes? Frank, what do you mean?" He met her eyes, his expression unreadable. "I mean you, Zoe. You've been different lately. Distracted, distant." Zoe swallowed, a small knot of panic twisting in her stomach. She searched for words, anything to explain her behavior without unraveling everything she had worked to keep hidden. I suppose I've just been busy. There's been a lot on my mind with Maddie, with home, with life in general." Frank didn't respond immediately, watching her with an intensity that made her heart pound. "I understand that, Zoe, but this feels like more than that. It feels like you're keeping something from me." Maddie's hands tightened around her fork, her pulse racing as she watched her parents exchange. She could feel the tension building, every word spoken like a spark in a dry field. Her father's suspicion, her mother's defensiveness, it all made her feel like the walls around their family were closing in, threatening to collapse. Zoe took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. "Frank, I promise, there's nothing you need to worry about. I would never do anything to hurt you or Maddie." Frank nodded slowly, but his eyes remained skeptical. "I want to believe that, Zoe. I really do." "I have a question," he said, looking directly at Zoe. "Who is Eric?" Zoe froze, her fork slipping from her hand and clattering against her plate. Across the table, Maddie's eyes widened, her heart pounding in her chest. The question hung in the air, and Zoe's mind raced as she tried to come up with an answer that wouldn't set everything unraveling. He's just an old friend from college," Zoe managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank's gaze remained steady, his jaw tight. "Just an old friend?" His voice carried a hint of challenge. "Zoe, I don't need more lies. I only want the truth." Maddie sat motionless, her heart hammering as she watched her parents. She hadn't expected her father to confront her mother so directly, and she felt caught between her loyalty to him and her desire to protect Zoe's secret. Zoe swallowed hard, feeling trapped, her mind frantically searching for an explanation. "Yes, Frank," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. He was someone I dated a long time ago in college. We reconnected, and yes, we've exchanged some messages. But that's it." Frank's eyes narrowed, his tone growing harsher. "So that's it? He was just an ex-boyfriend you wanted to catch up with?" Zoe shifted in her chair, her pulse racing. "Yes, that's all. There's nothing between us now, Frank." "I wouldn't," her voice faltered, and she struggled to finish the sentence. He leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "Nothing between you now? Then explain to me why you lied last weekend. You told me you were with friends, but you were with him, weren't you?" Zoe's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, unable to face the anger and hurt in her husband's eyes. "Yes, I was with him," she admitted softly. "But it wasn't what you think, Frank. I want to see him to end things, to make sure we wouldn't stay in contact." Frank's face tightened, his disappointment visible in every line of his expression. "So, you've been lying to me, meeting your ex-boyfriend behind my back, and you expect me to believe that nothing happened?" Zoe's hands clenched into fists, her voice shaking as she tried to hold back her emotions. "Frank, please, you have to understand. I didn't. I couldn't betray you. I couldn't betray our family." Frank's voice grew steely, a controlled fury simmering beneath the surface. "I need to know one thing, Zoe. Did you sleep with him?" Zoe's face crumpled, and she shook her head, her voice barely audible. No. I swear I didn't. Frank, I couldn't do that." Frank nodded slowly, though his eyes remained skeptical. Frank's gaze hardened as he looked from Zoe to Maddie. The silence was thick, charged with accusations and unspoken fears. Finally, he took a deep breath, looking straight at Maddie. "I think our daughter has something to say," he said firmly, his tone leaving little room for argument. Maddie's heart thudded in her chest, her palms growing damp with nerves. She glanced at her mother, who looked back with a mixture of confusion and dread, then quickly turned her gaze back to her father. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about," Maddie replied, her voice wavering. Her mind raced, torn between her loyalty to her mother and the guilt that gnawed at her as she watched her father's pained expression. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything, but she couldn't bring herself to hurt her mother like that. Frank's eyes narrowed. He saw through her hesitance, the way she avoided his gaze. "Don't lie to me, Maddie. You told me that Isabella's dad dropped you off that night, but I remember the car. I memorized the license plate and was able to recognize something. The license plate was registered to Eric. So, tell me the truth, were you with your mother and this Eric?" Zoe's face drained of color as she turned to Maddie, her eyes wide with shock. "Maddie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maddie felt a surge of panic. She hadn't expected her father to find out so much, hadn't thought he'd follow up on a simple license plate. There was no avoiding it now. She had to tell him something. "Dad, please, it's not what you think," Maddie said, her voice trembling. I was following Mom. I was just trying to find out what was going on, and it was an accident that I ended up there." "So, you were with her," Frank replied, his voice a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. "Both of you were hiding this from me." "Frank, I didn't know." Zoe protested, her voice desperate. "I didn't know Maddie was involved in any of this. She was acting on her own." Frank shook his head, his face etched with betrayal as he looked between them. "So, the two of you were spending time with Eric behind my back? My wife and my daughter." His voice cracked with anger. "Do you two even realize how this feels to me?" Maddie's chest tightened, guilt and fear swirling inside her. She hated seeing her father like this, seeing him so hurt and betrayed. She wanted to defend her mother, to make him understand that nothing truly damaging had happened. "Dad, please," she said, her voice pleading. "Mom didn't do anything wrong. She didn't betray you." Frank's gaze sharpened, and he let out a bitter laugh. "Didn't betray me? So it's not betrayal for her to meet with an ex-boyfriend and lie to me about it? And you, Maddie, you followed her and kept this secret from me. How can I believe either of you?" Maddie's face flushed with anxiety, her words spilling out before she could stop them. "Dad, it's not like that. They just kissed. Once, and that was it." The words seemed to echo around the room, and Maddie's heart sank as she realized what she had just admitted. Zoe gasped, her hands covering her mouth, and Frank's face darkened, a flicker of fury in his eyes. Frank turned to Zoe, his voice low and trembling with rage. "You kissed him." His words were as much an accusation as they were a statement, each syllable biting. Zoe's voice quivered as she tried to explain. "Frank, it was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was just a moment, and I stopped it before it went any further. Please, you have to believe me." Frank's face twisted with hurt and bitterness. So, you and Maddie have been covering for each other this whole time? Hiding the truth from me? How am I supposed to believe a word either of you says now? Maddie's heart shattered as she saw the raw pain in her father's face. Dad, I'm sorry, she whispered, fighting back tears. I didn't mean to hide anything from you. I was just confused, and I didn't know how to tell you without hurting you. Frank scoffed, shaking his head. His voice dropped to an ominous tone. And now I can't help but wonder if there's more you're hiding from me, Maddie. He looked directly at her, his expression cold and guarded. I'm starting to think that maybe you're not my daughter. The word struck like a slap, and Maddie felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her. What? She gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Dad, how could you say that? Zoe's face filled with shock, and she reached out to Frank, her eyes brimming with tears. Frank, don't even say that. Maddie is your daughter. You know that. But Frank pulled away, his expression hardening further. Do I? Because right now, I feel like I don't know either of you at all. The room was thick with tension, every word hanging heavily in the air. Zoe's chest tightened as she looked at Frank, her heart breaking at the realization of the damage she had caused. She tried to reach for him, her voice a desperate whisper. Frank, I never wanted this to happen, she pleaded. I never meant to hurt you or to make you doubt our family. Frank looked at her, his gaze cold and distant. And yet here we are. My wife and daughter lying to my face, hiding things from me and expecting me to be okay with it. Zoe's tears spilled over as she tried to keep her composure. Frank, I'm so sorry. I love you and I love this family. I don't want to lose you. He stared at her, his expression filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. I don't know if I can just forget all this, Zoe. I don't know if I can keep living with people I can't trust. Maddie's heart ached as she watched the pain on her parents' faces. She wanted to say something to make it all better, to bridge the gap that had opened between them, but the words wouldn't come. She had never felt so helpless, so powerless to change the course of her family's life. Finally, Frank stood up, his face set in determination. Maybe we need some time apart. Maybe that's the only way I can figure out what to believe. Zoe's face fell, and she shook her head in desperation. No, Frank, please. We can work this out together. But Frank shook his head, his voice cold and final. I don't see how. Right now, I need space to even begin to make sense of this betrayal. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Zoe and Maddie sitting in stunned silence, the reality of their fractured family settling over them like a shroud. A few minutes after he stormed out of the dining room, Frank returned. Zoe and Maddie both looked up, a glimmer of hope lighting in their eyes. But Frank's face was hard, resolved, his eyes clouded with hurt. He took a deep breath, his voice low and steady. Zoe, I'm sorry, he began, his tone lacking the warmth that had once filled it. But I've seen the messages between you and Eric. I saw the way you wrote to him, the nostalgia, the longing. Right now, it's hard for me to believe that our family is strong and reliable anymore. His gaze shifted to Maddie, softening slightly. And Maddie, you disappointed me too. I know you're still a child, and I can't hold you to the same standard, but it's painful to know you were hiding things from me. Zoe's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step forward. Frank, please, don't do this. It was a mistake. I know I hurt you, but don't let this destroy everything we've built. Frank shook his head, holding up a hand to stop her. Tonight's dinner was a farewell, he said. Tomorrow, I'm leaving to stay somewhere else. I need time. Zoe's face crumpled, and Maddie's heart plummeted, her voice breaking as she tried to plead with him. Dad, please don't go. I know I let you down, but I'll do anything to make it right. Frank's jaw tightened. Don't pressure me, either of you, he said, his voice wavering only slightly. Give me time, or I'll break and file for a damn divorce. His words landed like a blow. Zoe and Maddie both broke into tears, their attempts to convince him to stay falling on deaf ears. Frank, firm and resolute, held his ground. He retreated to his room, leaving Zoe and Maddie in a dazed silence, clutching onto each other, feeling the weight of their mistakes press down like an unrelenting wave. The next day, Frank left as he had said, without a glance back. Zoe tried to remain strong, even as she felt her world cracking around her. She poured all her energy into being there for Maddie, who was consumed with guilt. Every moment was a reminder of the father she missed and the fragile state of their family. "Mom, I can't stop thinking about it," Maddie said one night, her voice small and filled with remorse. "If I hadn't followed you that day, if I'd just stayed away." "Maddie, no," Zoe said, wrapping her daughter in a tight embrace. "This isn't your fault. This is an adult problem, a mess I created. You were just trying to protect us. Please, don't blame yourself." But the guilt weighed heavily on them both. Zoe felt the need to prove her loyalty, to find a way to repair the damage she had caused. She reached out to Frank a few days later, suggesting they take a paternity test to remove any doubt from his mind. Though the suggestion was painful, Zoe knew it was the only way to begin to rebuild his trust. After a tense and quiet agreement, the test results came back. Maddie was Frank's daughter. When he read the results, he felt a glimmer of relief, a sense of validation that helped steady him. He was thankful, though his heart was still bruised by the betrayals and secrets that had been kept from him. The weeks that followed were strained, but marked by small, cautious attempts at reconciliation. Zoe's messages to Frank became earnest, filled with remorse and a desire to heal. She kept asking herself what she could do to prove her commitment to their marriage, to show that she was willing to make things right. And she could see that Frank, though deeply wounded, was trying to keep an open mind. It was one evening, during one of their awkward and tentative conversations, that Zoe made a bold decision. She suggested they try something drastic, a lie detector test, to put every doubt to rest. Frank's eyes narrowed with surprise, but Zoe pressed on, her voice unwavering. "I need you to know that I didn't sleep with Eric. I need you to hear the truth. If it takes a lie detector test to convince you, then I'm willing to do it." Frank studied her for a long moment, taken aback by her determination. After a few days of consideration, he agreed, and they arranged for the test. Zoe steeled herself, prepared to bear her emotions, her truths, to the very core. The test results showed exactly what she had claimed. Zoe had not been physically unfaithful to Frank. But the test also exposed her emotional conflict, her hidden attraction to Eric, a longing she had tried so hard to deny but couldn't fully control. When Frank saw the results, he was silent. Relief and sadness warred within him. She had, indeed, stopped short of any physical betrayal, but her emotional involvement was undeniable, a wound that left him raw and uncertain. His mind churned with the painful knowledge, his trust shaken but not entirely broken. Zoe looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. "Frank, I know what I felt was wrong, and I know I hurt you. I can't change what I felt, but I can promise you it's over. I want to rebuild what we had. I want to earn back your trust." Frank took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He thought about the years they'd shared, the life they had built, and the daughter who looked up to them both. Divorce loomed as an option, a clean break from the hurt, but he found himself wavering. There was a chance, a glimmer of possibility, that they could rebuild, that time and patience could heal what had been broken. "Maybe," he began slowly, his voice filled with hesitation. "Maybe we don't need to end this. Not yet. It won't be easy, and I don't know how long it will take, but maybe, step by step, we can try to rebuild." Zoe's eyes filled with tears of relief, and she nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew that his forgiveness would not come quickly, but this was the hope she had clung to, the chance to mend what had nearly shattered beyond repair. As the weeks turned into months, Zoe and Maddie devoted themselves to mending the fractured family. Maddie's guilt lessened as she poured her energy into building back her father's trust, finding small ways to remind him of their bond. Zoe, too, took every opportunity to prove her dedication, embracing the small steps that brought them closer to where they once were. Frank, still nursing his own heartache, opened himself gradually, bit by bit, allowing himself to hope again. It wasn't an easy journey. Trust took time to rebuild, and some days were harder than others. But with patience, understanding, and an unwavering commitment to each other, they began to find a way forward, rebuilding their family one fragile step at a time. If you enjoyed this tale of tangled affairs, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for listening and have a nice day.